Okay, welcome back to Intro to 3D. This is Kim Edwards speaking. We're going to do a lighting software overview where we're just going to look at how to manipulate some of the basic features of the lights that are available in Maya. So first off, we'll look at where you create them. So you can create them up here in lights. So I'm going to make a directional light here, and they always get made at the origin like any object. You can use move and rotate. Some lights you can scale, which will affect them, but there's some other tools to help you place them. So if you go over to modify and go to transformation tools, you'll see there's a show manipulator tool. This is useful because it gives you a little look at point where the light will always look at, which is a good way of manipulating them. The other way that you can manipulate the placement of them, and I'll turn the lights on in the viewport here, is you can choose to look through them. So if I go to panels, the light selected, and go to look through selected, that will give me the viewpoint of the light. So if I can just manipulate the view as per normal, and that will affect the placement of the light. I can go back to my perspective view, and that's the view of my light now. So that's handy. Let's go through our different light types. So first off, the one that I made before is a directional light. So this is a light which is got parallel beams of light that don't converge, and it doesn't matter where it is in your scene because it's just directional. It only goes in, it's only the rotation which controls it. So it's good for like sun or really big light sources like stadium lights or things like that. The light goes on infinitely forever. There's no options to make it sort of fall off over distance, and that's what our directional light is. So that's a good one. The next light, which would be very familiar, is a spotlight, and that is got a very familiar kind of shape. It's a conical throw of light, and this one has got basically the cone, and then we commonly refer to lights as being crisp or soft depending on how sharp the light throw is. So as you can see, this is very crisp or sharp, and you can soften it or make it more diffuse here by increasing this penumbra angle. So there's a control here for the cone angle, so the actual shape of that cone that we're throwing with the light, and then penumbra angle will soften that as well. And if you go through to the look through selected, it'll represent that in the viewport here as well. So the penumbra and the cone angle. So that's handy. So this is a good versatile light for, pointing at particular things. Then we've got a point light, which is an omnidirectional light, so a light that goes out in all directions. So if you think of a light globe, that's really going to be, this really just needs a move tool to work with it. So you can see it throws that light in all directions. So suitable for like a light globe or just generally to illuminate an area. Very useful. Then we've got another light which is called a volume light, which is quite handy because it's very much the same as a point light, being omnidirectional by default, but you can see that it's got this extra sort of icon in the viewport where it represents the fall off or the decay of the light over distance with a manipulator that's scalable. So at the center the light is at 100%, and at the very edge it's at 0%. So this is a really good light for having really kind of nice refined control over what it's actually hitting. So you can see here this would be 100%, and then over here it'll just be barely illuminated. So if I turn on my IPR render, we should be able to see that. So that's essentially like an uber point light where you can see the fall off really clearly with a manipulator. So that's our volume light. Then we've got a really soft light or a diffuse light called an area light, which by default is just a rectangle here. I'll just use row. Actually, use my manipulator tool. So this one is essentially similar to a soft light box, so a light that's going through some sort of very diffuse material that's spraying the light out in multiple directions. So this is a really nice soft light, and it also throws out shadows that are by default very soft and diffuse. We'll look at being able to change shadow attributes after this as well in the other lights, but this is just generally a very soft light. You can also, if you're using mental ray as your renderer, change the light shape to other shapes. So it can be a disc, for example, which has got a completely different sort of throw. It can be a sphere, so very much like a point light, and it can also be a cylinder, which you might be wondering, why would I want to use that? Well, it could be useful, for example, if you were wanting to do some fluorescent tubing. So in other words, if you're using mental ray as your renderer, you've got some other options in terms of the light shapes. I'll just turn it off for now. Then the final one that we've got is the ambient light. And the ambient light is really just a light that lifts the entire scene's values, if they're unlit, to whatever you specify. So at the moment it's specified at 1. I'll turn this ambient shade feature off, which essentially mix it with a point light, and you can see at the moment it's going to return everything being coloured as a result. So this kind of light is really used for faking light that's bouncing around and hitting everything. So for example, if I had this light over here, I'll just turn it off for a minute, and I had let's say I had a point light over on the far right, and that was going to illuminate my scene, and everything that isn't hit by that point light is going to be black. Yep. So with an ambient light I could lift the rest of the scene's values to be, you know, a little bit lighter than black. So that's what it's really there for. So it's a light to be used in conjunction with other lights. That's your ambient light. Okay, good. So let's have a look at some common things that you would want to be changing with your lights. So the first thing to note is that, with the exception of a directional light, is that lights don't usually go on forever. So in Maya, in this case, it represents the decay or fall off of the light over distance with this little icon here, decay rate. And you've got 3 different types. You've got a linear decay rate, a quadratic decay rate, which is a real world decay rate, and then a quartic decay rate, which is a very sharp fall off. So if I put, for example, linear on at the moment, now the light is going to not go on infinitely. And usually when you're using decay rates, you need to adjust your intensities accordingly. So put this up to 20, for example. So at 20, you can see the decay rate looks like so. It's quite a smooth decay rate. So it's basically the intensity divided by the distance is the decay rate of linear. Quadratic, however, is the intensity divided by the distance squared. So it's a much sharper fall off, and this is an inverse square fall off that is physically correct. Then we've got an even sharper one, which is cubic, which is intensity divided by distance to the power of 4. So it's a much steeper fall off. So those are our options for decays. So you want to use them. And we can have a look at them compared to each other. Just give me a second. I'll just pause for a second. Okay, I've just unhidden something I've made before, so I'll just go to the top view. Okay, so here I've got a light with no decay. This one's got linear, this one has got quadratic, and this one has got cubic. And we'll be able to see compare them. So you can see the one with no decay, the light strangely just keeps on going forever, which is not really kind of sensible, because it's going to light anything that it hits, so it might actually add to your render time. The linear one, you can see it's quite a gradual fall off. The quadratic one is steeper, and the cubic one is even steeper than that. So that's our fall offs that you will want to have on your lights. I'll just hide that now. The next thing we'll look at is our shadows. So I'm just going to focus in on this. So I've made a spotlight here, and at the moment the default shadow type is ray trace. So you've got two shadow types that you can choose from. There's ray trace shadows and there's shadow map shadows. The shadow map shadows use scanline rendering, and the ray trace shadows use ray tracing. So let's first off look at the default, which is ray trace shadows. So I'll just do a little render of this. So these shadows are quite sharp by default. To make them appear softer, so we're coming back to that sort of more diffuse soft term, if we think back to the area light and the types of shadows it was throwing, you need to increase, it's got this radius attribute that you can increase. So if I increase that to 0.5, for example, it'll give me a fall off where I have an umbra and a penumbra of a shadow. So an umbra is the central part of the shadow and penumbra is the outer part of the shadow. And what essentially happens is, as a light moves away, further away from the light and from the shadow casting object, other light feeds into the area, and so it appears softer. So you can look at that on your desk, for example. So the shadow is always going to be sharper right near the shadow caster and gets softer the further away. That also depends on how diffuse or soft the light is. So you can increase your light radius here, but the more you increase it, the more shadow rays that you need to throw down in order for it to have not a sort of really dirty looking shadow. And that will increase your render time. So it's a kind of balancing act between those two. Our other shadow type is the shadow map shadow, which I'll turn on now. Depth map shadows. So that looks pretty acceptable here. If you want to soften them, you can increase the filter size. So at the moment it's at 2. Let's put it at 0 for a minute. So if I put that at, say, 4, I should get quite a soft shadow. Yep. So these are really inexpensive and pretty versatile and good to use. However, one thing to note about them is that because they use a resolution, you should only really use them on a light that's got a concentrated throw area. If I use it on a directional light, so if I put this on a directional light, so I'll just change this light to a directional light, and I've got the same settings. You can see because the directional light goes over the entire scene, the actual shadow itself looks really pixelated. So suitable for using for lights that have got a constrained throw area. So that's our basics of actually using the lights inside of Maya. The next tutorials will actually look at doing some creative lighting exercises. Cool, thanks for watching. Okay, welcome back to Intro to 3D on our section on lighting. My name's Kim Edwards. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at lighting a tomato, and we're going to be basing our approach on a standard 3-point lighting setup. Yep. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a reference image that we're going to try and roughly match, just so we've got something to sort of strive for. So that is called tomato reference.jpg, and that's what it looks like up here. So we can have a look at things going on here. So there's some depth of field, so you can see there's a focal point where everything's sharp and then things are blurry, so that's more of a camera thing that we can put on later. There's reflections on the floor and some other stuff on the floor. We're going to just have a bit of reflection there. And then we've got some sources of lighting. It's a tomato shiny, but it's also got a sort of a little bit of translucency where the light is penetrating through. So you can see here we've got light hitting here and it's bleeding through. You may not be able to see in the video, but you'll certainly be able to see in the reference image, which you can open yourself. And we've obviously got some main sources of light. So there's probably a light in this direction over here and possibly over here as well. And the rest of it's just sort of light bouncing around the place. So you're probably best off, rather than just copying the numbers in the notes, to actually just do it a little bit by eye, following the approach. But we'll go through it together. So first thing we'll do is we'll strike our first light, which we're going to use as a backlight. So we're going to create an area light. So create light, area light. Make sure you watch the previous video that's just on just a lighting overview, so you're sort of clear on how to manipulate things. So I'll just move that around. So I'm just going to go to my show manipulator tool. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to scale it so we get a bigger sort of shape, so forth. Actually, in my notes, which I'm not going to exactly copy, I put 16. That's what I scaled it by, 16. Yep, just roughly. And then we're trying to position this so that we can hit the tomato from sort of screen right, and kind of get a highlight on the side here. So I'll need to do some IPR rendering as we go, so I can actually see what's going on with this light. So that looks sort of approximately right. Yep. And as you can see, at the moment it's got no fall off, so it's very bright. I'll just have another look at my reference image, just so we can have a look at that again, which I should just leave open, make life easier. So we're going to be using this to get this light on the side here, and you can see that's too bright at the moment. So I'm just going to adjust the strength of the light. First off, I'll give it some decay, which we know we should be doing. So I'm just going to put it on linear decay, and then I'm going to pump up the values a little bit. So I'm going to put it on, I don't know, 7 or something like that, roughly. Now at the moment we're getting too much specular highlight, so I might just move it back a little bit. I just want it to be more general, less shiny, more general source of light. And so really the settings that I've got written down for you could copy it and it would work, but it's probably better if you just play around with the general placement and adjust the values. You'll get more out of it, and that's what you'd really be doing in the kind of real world. I might just drop this down some more. So that's kind of like going to be our backlight, and we're using that to kind of get this general illumination here as well. I'm going to strike another light, so I'm going to turn that light off. The easiest way to turn lights off, apart from clicking on illuminates by default, is just to hide them. So if you just press Control H, Control H, that's your shortcut in Maya for hiding it. When you're striking lights, just so you can be sure you're focusing on that particular light, definitely turn other lights off. So we're going to use the second light, and that's going to be our main source of light, our kind of key light. You can see we've got a highlight over here. There's definitely a light from this kind of rear screen left direction. So let's have a look at that. So I'll strike another area light. Boom. And I'll scale that up. So just move it in a second. This one doesn't need to be quite so big. I think I say in my notes to do 8, but again, probably better just to adjust things by eye. So now I'll move it around using my show manipulator tool. So we want to hit this one kind of from the side. The placement's going to be pretty important for this one, so we might have to look through it as well. So that's what we're getting at the moment. And I'm just going to have to really tweak where it is. There we go. Now we're getting something. Now you've probably noticed that I've set some sort of translucency in the material. You can just see that here, so that we get this penetration of light. It's just over in, it's just a plain blend material, you can see. But further down here, under mental ray, I've turned on MI scatter radius and scatter color, given the radius 10 and the color, and so we're getting this effect happening of the light sort of penetrating through, particularly backlighting. It's a cheap sort of effect, but we kind of need something like that to help us give it a slight feel of it being a tomato. So now I'm just going to try and adjust this so I can get that hit of light, that specular highlight there, if I can, and get that sort of translucency happening. So this is really if I render again, you'll see it doesn't always pick up the translucency. So let's say that that's roughly right. I expect you to spend more time on yours, just demonstrating the general approach. So then same again, I'm going to turn on some decay, set it to linear, and then look at what values I should make my light in terms of intensity. So with linear on, probably need to bump this up a bit. So 25. It's got to be it's going to be the brighter source of light in the whole scene. If I recall, the other one was about 7. So I'll have a look at that. Yep. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn both the lights on and look at them in relation to each other. So I'll unhide the last light. I can just go, so it was the last thing that I hid, and I hid before I can go show, display, show last hidden. And now I've got the two lights visible. And you can see we're kind of getting there. Probably do need some adjustment, but we've got this big black spot here, and that's not really representative of what we've got over here at all. Yep. So I'm missing this sort of edge reflection going on here. So what I'm going to do is we need some sort of light to bump everything up, and that's going to be our fill light. And for that, we just need a kind of general light. So I'm going to use an omnidirectional light. I'm going to use, you guessed it, a point light. So point light, I can just use move to adjust. Now I might be putting this point light through the floor, so I don't want it to be occluded by the floor, so I'm going to turn shadows off. So it's going to cast no shadows, so no matter what, this light is going to have an effect on my scene, because it's not going to be casting a shadow, as you can see. So that's good. So we're just going to move it into a favorable position. Now this render view doesn't always capture movement of lights, so you can help with that by turning off progressive mode, and it'll take longer to render, but it will always sort of capture the adjusting in terms of the position of the lights, as you can see. So I'm now going to just tone down this light, which I'm just going to use to lift everything. So I'm going to put it down to something really small in value. I don't know, 0.25 I'll look at. So I just want to use this one to bump everything up a little bit, and I might have it a little bit more screen left. Alright, so my final one I spent much longer adjusting it, and I expect you to, but that's a basic reasonable setup for this. I'll probably just do a few more little adjustments with them all together. Let's see if I can get this highlight a little bit nicer. the left, maybe. Oh, that's more like it. I might actually just look through that for the moment, see if I can get a sweeter spot.
Doing it right now. Oh, right before you go, just off the top of your head, you might be a
Okay, and let's go to a perspective view. Maybe this one. Perhaps this one I don't even want specular, so you can actually turn that off. Certainly going to be closer to this. Now, of course, we can also adjust the color of the lights. So, put a little bit of yellow in there. What have you. So you can adjust yours till you get a nice looking tomato. It's always going to look a bit plasticky because there's not much of a material on here. Okay, so then that's our lights happening. Now I'm just going to zoom in and just double check on our shadows. So let's have a look at these shadows that we've got going on. So if you recall, the point light, which is our fill light, doesn't have any shadows on, but our area lights have got area light type shadows. And we'll just have a look at them. They don't look too bad, but if yours are a bit noisy, you'll probably need to adjust the shadow parameters for them and increase the shadow rays. Try and stick to about 8 or something. Mine aren't too bad. I think this one here is a little bit noisy, so I might just up these to 4. And just adjust them. Sometimes you've got to, it's a combination of adjusting your quality settings, which mine's at 0.5, which should be fine in conjunction with the shadow rays. But look, this looks reasonably fine. So the next thing I'm going to do is just get my framing to roughly match the reference. So that's our reference. Yep. So because it's a portrait view, I need to tear off, go to panel, go to view panels, and go tear off a copy in order to, and zoom in this, scale this, in order to be able to see the actual framing. So I want to get something slightly similar to that, so I just need to kind of adjust this up a bit. Have a look. Okay, that should be nice. Yep. And the next thing we can do is the depth of field. So I'll select the camera. I've asked you to make another camera to do this, so just make another camera, but I'm just going to use the perspective one, seeing as I'm already at that step. So I'm going to work out what the focal point is using these clipping planes. So these define the maximum distance that the camera will render. So if I put this at say 10, it's not going to render anything beyond 10 in terms of the distance from the camera to the scene. 20, and I'm starting to get the tomato. 25. So maybe my focal point from this particular camera's position should be about 20, it looks like to me. So I'll set this back to 10,000, and then I'll go down to depth of field and check on depth of field, set my focus distance to 20, f-stop, and I'll leave it 5.6, which is the aperture, and I'm going to have my focus region scale as 0.5, which will just mean that it broadens the actual focal region a bit. So now when I do a render, and this time I'll actually do a render, it will render with depth of field on. So I just paused that while it rendered. I can probably afford to decrease my focus region scale if I look at this. But those are the essential sort of basic steps that we've done to to create this. So save your file out once you're happy with it as tomato finish.myascii and save out your render as tomato lighting.tiff. Great, thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back to your Introduction to 3D tutorial. This is another tutorial on lighting, and what we've got here is we have a scene. I'll just go through a general perspective view so you can see how it's set up. So there's basically a desk in here and a window. Outside of the window we've got a picture, and inside we've got a picture frame and some books, and importantly from inside of here as well we've got pretty much a closed space. So this plane here is flagged to be rendered only on the inside, so it lets you know, we can see through it from this side, but it's keeping the whole thing closed up, which will be important when we have a look at putting some lights in here. So this is a good scene because there's clear motivation for the light. So that's one thing you're trying to look for when you're lighting something, is what's the motivation, what's the main source, that kind of makes general sense to an audience. So in this case it's obviously the window. So I'll start off by putting a spotlight in and just adjusting that. So I just want to have that point through the window, whoop, like so. Probably point through there. I'll have a look through it, make sure I'm kind of getting where I think I want it. So I want to have it kind of move through the window and hit the wall, casting some nice shadows as well. Just have to adjust my cone angle. These things shouldn't be new to you if you've done the other videos. And while I'm here, I'm going to change the shadows to depth shadows, and I'll pump up the intensity and put some decay so the light doesn't go on forever. So I'll make it quadratic, and the intensity I'm going to set it to, I don't know, 3000. Good-o. So let's go have a look back through our camera and turn lights on in the viewport to get an idea of what that'll look like. And I can also IPR render, so I'll just IPR render that. Here's my IPR renderer. And that's what I've got going on at the moment. So quite dark, really, when you look at it. So one thing that is very common, and some software now defaults to it, is to work in with lights in a slightly different way. So there's different ways that brightness and so forth is handled by computers, and computer displays can only show a range, and renderers tend to work in a linear range of color where the values move from 0 to 1 in a linear fashion. Screens change that. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up working in linear lighting, which I suggest that you do as a default kind of position when you're working in Maya. So to do that, and you'll see the effect of that, so that's that at the moment, we need to change a couple of things. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go to render settings, and there is a tab here that says enable color management. So we'll turn that checkbox on, and generally when we're bringing textures and so forth in, so you can see here, for example, I've got an actual Auerbach painting that I grabbed from the web to use as the painting in the scene. That's in an sRGB color space. That's a color space that is suitable for display on our monitors, and that's what our monitor is going to show. So we're going to ask Maya to convert incoming images from sRGB, which is what they'll be in, to a linear color, so that it can work with it in the renderer, which by default is going to be working in linear color values. Great. The other thing we'll do while we're in here is we'll make sure, I think mine is already set, but check yours, is that over in the frame buffer, we're setting the data type, which might be default in 8-bit color. So we have different different depths of color in terms of how color is represented. Most image files are made up of 3 channels: a red channel, and a green channel, and a blue channel, with black and white values controlling how much blue there is, how much green there is, and how much red there is. And they are made up of usually 256 colors, which when you combine them together produces 1.67 million colors. But there are actually other color spaces which can be so that's an 8-bit. So this channel here is 8-bit, which means 2 to the power of 8, which is 256, but you can work in higher color spaces in terms of color depth, from 16 to 32-bit color, which is what you might have heard of high dynamic range color. So that you're going into values which you can't represent on a monitor, but because you make changes on a computer with levels and things like that, it's useful to have that extra data there. So we're going to say to MAYA in this case that we're going to be working in RGBA half for 16-bit. So that's a red, green, blue, and alpha channel. Cool, so that's that part done. Then, in terms of how we're going to get MAYA to then display it back to us, is we want MAYA to show us in our render view. So over in options, we want it to display to us, we want it to convert it then back the other direction. So we want to convert it from linear, which is what the renderer is working in, to sRGB. Yep. So with that on, you should be able to scrub back in the video and see a difference in terms of how this actually now looks. So I'll render it now. Again, we should be getting a much better spread of our light within this scene. So that's our second step. We've struck our first light. The motivation for the light is the window, obviously, and we've set up our MAYA to be working in linear lighting. Great. Now, at the moment, we've only been working with lights, as you can see here, that when they hit something, they return the color from the material there, maybe some specular highlight, maybe some reflection. And that's it, they stop traveling. In the real world, we know that light bounces around, so it'll hit something, bounce off it. So we can do that kind of bounced lighting inside of MAYA really easily. So with Mental Ray, it's in the Indirect Lighting tab, and let's compare the two. So this is our render at the moment. I'll just stop the IPR renderer and click on Keep Image. So we've got an image that we can flick back to. Yep. And now I'm going to turn on, in the Indirect Lighting tab, the checkbox for Final Gathering, which is one way in which Mental Ray does indirect lighting. And I'm going to turn on secondary diffuse bounces to 1. So that'll mean that the light will go through, hit a surface, and then hit another thing, and then bounce from that and hit one more time. So now I haven't changed anything to do with the lights. I'm just going to click on IPR render and let it do its thing. So the first thing it does is it displays a final gathering pass where it's looking at the bounced light before it does the actual render. So just pause it, and I've just resumed, and you can see the dramatic difference that makes. So we've still just got one light source, but the light's now bouncing around. And if you remember, I made this so that it was an enclosed space, an enclosed room, and everything's bouncing around now, so that we're getting a lot more illumination in here, which is quite natural, just from one light. So isn't that fantastic? Okay, so then I'm going to add another fill light. So just while I do that, I'll just turn off the final gathering. I'll just stop that for a minute. So I'm going to add another fill light, and to my mind, I'm trying to think of a motivation for it as if there was some artificial light source inside of the room itself. So a light globe or something somewhere in the room. So I'm going to make a point light and move that around the place. So I'm going to give it a I don't know, value like 100 or something. Give it some decay, maybe 250, and just turn my other light off. So just focus on what that one's doing. Whoop. Turn the IPR render on, and then I'll position that light. So to make it seem artificial, I'm going to give it a little bit of a bit of colour. I have to IPR again to reflect that. There we go. And I have to, oh, I've just done it in the wrong light. I was thinking I couldn't see any colour changes. So I'm just going to good. So it seems to be going a little bit too far for my liking. Great. So this is going to be my artificial light source for the room. Great, that works for me. We'll see. Maybe 100. I'll give it 100. Don't want it to be too bright. Alright, turn my other light back on. So you can see this is kind of pretty pain-free process. So I will just going to IPR render the camera view. IPR camera. And have a look at that. So that's what we've got at the moment without final gathering and with final gathering. If you can light the scene nicely without the final gathering, by all means don't have it on, because it just slows things down. I'm just going to make it a little bit quicker just by decreasing the accuracy so I don't have such a delay. So that's getting there. You can of course adjust your values to brighten it up a little bit more, maybe get some more interesting shadows. By all means feel free to put another light in. So that's good. Alright, so after you've adjusted it, I'm going to say that this is okay. What we're next going to do is we're going to add some volumetric lights, so some actual sort of God rays coming through the window here. So like the light moving through, hitting a bit of particles of dust and so forth, and we're getting a visible kind of little bit of a glow haze coming through the window. So to do that, we're going to grab our spotlight. I'm just going to turn the final gathering off for a moment. So I'm going to grab the spotlight and we're going to do a few things. Here under light effects, I'm going to click on the image swatch and it's going to put this light fog in there, which is great. And then I'm going to just grab that spotlight again and go to the cone shape here, and this is where down here in volume samples I'm going to adjust the quality for this. But before I do that, let me go back into my perspective view, and the cone shape is it's made basically a placeholder object for volume, and in this case it's a visible cone that I can now scale to sort of go through my scene, and this is going to have a volume shader attached to it so that we get the effect of light moving through some sort of substance. In this case, we're thinking dust or something like that, so we can get some God rays. So now I'll just do another re-render, and this will probably be a very bright at the moment. We shall see. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit of noise and so forth, but you can get the sense of there being a glow kind of coming through the window. And let's now have a look at our options here for the quality. So I am going to go to Volume Samples Override, turn that on, and I'm also going to turn on Depth Jitter. And let's just say we'll put the volume samples just at the moment to 8 to have a look at. And I'll do another render. So another look at doing the render. So I just do a render. Okay, I paused that while it rendered, so you can see now that's quite good. So then the next thing I might want to do is adjust how much it falls off. I might want to have it fall off a little bit more than that. So I shall just have a look a little bit here at the values for the fog. So I've got spread and I've got intensity. Just put intensity up for a minute. Focus in on that. IPR render. Okay, doesn't look like it's getting included quite right on the window frame here, so I can either move the light or have a look at the problem. Usually it has to be a double-sided kind of object to occlude it. Slightly different, and maybe I'll just see if changing this spread helps with toning the distance of it down. Alternatively, I might just have to scale my light. I think I will. 0.8. I want it to be there, but I don't want it to be overbearing. So I'll just do some more scaling of this light, perhaps. So good. So you can feel free to adjust it some more until you're kind of happy. Just going to identify what my problem is here. We seem to have light coming through. Not sure. And then the rest is really just moving things around a little bit so that you're kind of happy with the values in relation to each other. One thing that we can do to speed the rendering up of this is change the shadow map method. So under quality and shadows, we can change the shadow map from, it's usually on simple, to segments. That will help. One was already on it. So that will speed things up. You might want to put a filter on your shadows over in here. So you can increase the resolution and maybe increase the filter size to say 2. Just to soften them a little bit more. And hopefully get rid of some of the noise that's present. And then again, if you need to really play with getting rid of some of these noise values, usually start from individual things before you go up to cranking up all your render settings. Is see if you can increase your render samples. Say 32 should do the trick, and you should get a better result. And then the rest is just adjusting the levels on each of your lights until you get a composition that you're happy with. Right, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching.